The Godfather of Poker by Doyle Brunson. We've got a book review today. Welcome, everyone. I'm reading 15 poker books in 2024 as part of a poker book club that I'm running. This is the first book we're going to talk about right here, The Godfather of Poker. Doyle Brunson is the most famous poker player of all time. So if you know anything about poker, you know about Doyle Brunson. I'd read Super System before, which is a strategy book that he came out with. His biography, less well read. So we start this story in a small town in West Texas. I looked it up today, and there's under 600 people that live there today. The roads are still not paved. When we start our story, Doyle is living in the Great Depression, and he doesn't have a shower until he's 13 years old. So a very different time in the world. And out of this small town, of this void, if you will, comes the greatest, the most famous poker player of all time. So we start by learning about Doyle's history as an athlete. He is a very proficient track athlete, baseball player, but basketball is his main skill. And he's on track to becoming like a professional. He's one of the best. His leg gets crushed in an industrial accident and ends his career as an athlete. Okay. But then Doyle finds the game of poker. And he plays on this street in Fort Worth, Texas, Exchange Avenue, right? This street is really hairy, right? You have some of the most aggressive sort of individuals coming together to play poker, as largely self-policed as well. So you have shootouts, you have stick-ups or hold-ups, robberies on the street. You are going to be brushing shoulders with a lot of people that would not shy away from killing you if you get on the wrong side. And this was like sort of normal everyday life of a poker player at this time in Texas. So amazing. This is like late 50s. To understand this is the history our game came from, right? And so he cuts his teeth a little bit there. He talks a little bit about starting his family, meeting his wife, starting to have kids. Eventually he plays a little bit more around Texas and then finds his way to Las Vegas, and that's where the majority of the story takes place, and he sort of sets down roots. He talks about starting in Las Vegas when it's a mob town, and brushing shoulders with the two main characters in Casino. The mob bosses are, according to him, like fairly good representations of who these guys were in real life, and getting the sense that essentially working in Las Vegas as a professional, rubbing shoulders with the mob, you were really kind of out of control as to what they wanted to do was what was going to go. But then he also talks about the Horseshoe and Benny Binion. And those early years, the World Series of Poker. He won 2 World Series of Poker main events back to back, both with 10 deuce, which is so amazing. So you sort of learn about the history of the World Series, which is now our most important game ever, right? So you get that background. You hear about Stu Unger and his stories in the early days. You hear a lot about golf gambling and how big golf gambling was at this time. I think it was probably the second most important thing in Doyle's life was golf to him. It was a huge game. And he spent a lot of years primarily gambling on the golf course, trying to get a golf match going, and playing out there, battling it out as a guy that used to want to be a golf pro. That was really cool to see. And so at one point he gets cancer. It just miraculously disappears, even though you think he's going to die. He talks about he loses a daughter, unfortunately, when she was 18 years old, named Doyle. And he turns to religion for about a year, where he doesn't play much poker for 6 months, 9 months or so, and sort of turns to religion to get through that. And he talks about how a bunch of poker players sort of joined him on that journey. He talks about starting businesses, most of which really failed. And did not do very well at all. Starting a television company, like a mining company, all sorts of stuff. Mostly failed, but then he wrote Super System. This is one of the greatest, if not the greatest, selling poker book of all time. A strategy book. Kind of took what he knew as a road gambler and he figured out and put it onto paper. And it was a massive success, especially during the poker boom when it got to later on. 2004, 2005, 2006. One time was like #1 New York Times bestseller in its category. Was massive, right? And so that was really interesting to me, is that Doyle Brunson is through and through a gambler, right? But he had all these interesting side projects that took time away from poker, like golf and like business. But he always came back to his sort of home base of poker. And so Vegas changes. The mob bosses get whacked. It turns more corporate. We go through the poker boom. Everything changes, and poker players become celebrities. And you see the success of sort of this lifestyle in this crazy time when everyone and their dog is playing poker in America and around the world to a large degree. And we end the book after talking a little bit about some of the highest stakes matches ever against Andy Beal. We end the book with some of his thoughts on life, what's worth living in life, and what is a good life, and some of the things that are important to him, like his wife, like his family, some of the people he spent time with, like Chip Reese, along the way, and his family. And that's the conclusion. So the first half of this book is largely sort of a linear narrative of going through life over time, and the back half of the book feels more like, well, let me tell you this story about this one time, right? And those stories are really familiar. Someone put in our book club thread that it's like talking to an old relative and hearing stories, and it has that sort of good feeling to it. So what's the experience like to read this book? And if you play poker for fun, poker is a small part of your life, but you enjoy it, I think you'll enjoy this book. It's very entertaining, right? It highlights these sort of outrageous situations that can only happen in a game of poker when you're sitting with strangers, but familiar strangers that you see regularly until 4 a.m. You're going to have crazy things that come up. You're going to get into a bit of trouble. You're going to have sort of personalities clash, but underneath that is hilarity and a shared experience and an understanding you're doing something a little different than the rest of the world, right? So there is camaraderie, and I wrote about this a little bit and published an article on Poker.org, and it kind of feels a bit like a sleepover, right? when you're a young kid and you're sleeping over with your friends. It's adventurous, it's a little rebellious, it's a little interesting, it's just a little different. And so I think you get to feel that at the poker table, and you feel that through this story. Crazy events, danger, excitement, debauchery in moments, right? Sincerity as well. So it's great. But if you are a gambler, right? If you're a lifer, if you're a grinder, this book is more romantic than that. You know, this is a history through one man's eyes, right? Like just through his eyes, this is a history of his life in poker, but it's also a history of poker and where it's born out of, right? He is our first superstar. He's called the Godfather of poker for a reason. He, in a lot of ways, launched the game to what it is today. And so to see poker through his eyes, even though it's an idealized version, is to understand what it is that we play today. There is an element of those Texas road gamblers that still exists in the norms and the cultures and the way that we talk about ourselves today. You know, in the 5-10 game at Bellagio that's going right now, there's an element of that past history that lives on. And so reading this book, I think, is a must if poker is a big part of your life, because you get to understand what we're born out of to some extent. I think it's worth mentioning just briefly, you know, when I was sharing some of this book on social media, I received a bunch of DMs, and some of the DMs were not positive in regards to some of the things I was sharing. So it's worth noting, like, those aren't my stories to tell, right? But this is one man's perspective, one man's eyes, and it's a heroic story of his life and of the game of poker. And so, for better or worse, I think you need to read it if poker's a big deal to you. Like I said, The Godfather of Poker by Doyle, Brunson, and Mike Cochran. That's it for January. Next up in February, if you want to join us in the book club, feel free to. It's on Discord. The Mathematics of Poker, to understand sort of the granular engine underneath the decisions that we're making in the game. So it should be interesting. That's it. Hope you enjoyed. Subscribe wherever you're watching this, or follow. And see you in March.